Hi, welcome back to Alaska. I'm here atop a bluff alongside the Tanana River, just a short distance from where the Alaska Pipeline crosses that river on its journey from Prudhoe Bay to Valdez, which you'll learn about in a later lecture. Today, I am standing here in the middle of one of the interior of Alaska to talk about Alaska and its role in World War II. Now, Alaska, so far away from the rest of the United States, it may seem like it wouldn't have had much to do with World War II, but actually, Alaska would be the site of intense activity during the war, as well as the site of the only invasion by Japanese forces on the continental US soil. So to start off, we will talk about that Japanese invasion, which actually took place hundreds of miles from here on the far-flung Aleutian Islands, part of the long chain of islands that stretches off the coast of Alaska nearly all the way to Asia. So those islands, the islands of Attu and Kiska, would be the site of a Japanese invasion. Now this started off in June of 1942. A Japanese fleet coordinating with the fleet that would attack Midway Island at that decisive turning point of the war. A different fleet also branched off to head for the Aleutian Islands. Starting on June 3rd, 1942, that fleet would begin bombing the Alaskan city of Unalaska and Dutch Harbor, which is now one of the most important commercial fishery ports in the United States. But at that time, it bombed the naval facilities at Dutch Harbor, then proceeded on June 6th and June 7th to invade the islands of Attu and Kiska. Kiska invaded on June 6th, Attu invaded on June 7th. So those islands were quickly overrun. There was not a large American military presence on those islands. The native population, the Onondagas or Aleut peoples, were under Japanese occupation for several months. So from June until September, at which point they were actually taken from those islands and removed to the Japanese island of Hokkaido, where they would be interned. So those islands were under occupation for nearly a year. It would not be until May of 1943 that the US would be able to muster forces to try to retake those islands and deny the Japanese a foothold on this side of the Pacific. The great fear was that with Japan in control of those islands, they could serve as a launching point for further Japanese invasions and attacks on the US West Coast. Cities like Vancouver, Seattle, Vancouver of course in Canada, but the Canadians were our allies, so we were concerned about them as well. But Seattle, Portland, San Francisco, Los Angeles, all of those cities were under threat from those Japanese forces. So on the 11th of May, 1943 is when the US began its operation to recapture the island of Attu. Now this landing and the invasion and the entire battle was fought in some of the worst conditions imaginable. The Aleutian Islands have an incredibly inhospitable climate. I say that as I'm standing here atop of an exposed river bluff. It's windy, it's cold, it's actually above zero for once, but it's still pretty cold when you factor in that wind chill. The Aleutian Islands, if you can believe it, were even worse. They were wet, frigid, mountainous, rugged, covered in terrain that no army vehicles could cross, leading to incredible problems. In fact, during that attack in which the Japanese fought back with intense ferocity against the American invasion, more US soldiers were injured by the cold than suffered injury from Japanese attack, if you can believe it. More than 1,200 soldiers suffered injuries due to the cold, frostbite, hypothermia, things like that, while only 1,148 were injured by Japanese attack. So it was an incredibly difficult campaign. It waged on until May 29th, when the remaining Japanese forces initiated a banzai charge, essentially a suicide charge, which left almost all Japanese forces on the island dead. only about 29 Japanese soldiers out of the thousands who had occupied Attu were captured. So it was an incredibly bloody and brutal campaign, more than 3,900 US casualties overall. And so as soon as that had been finished being captured on May 29th, then they began to gear up to recapture the island of Kiska. They brought in troops with more experience in cold weather for this attack. However, it would end up not actually mattering, because on August 15th, 1943, when a combined US and Canadian force of over 30,000 troops landed to retake Kiska, they found that the Japanese had actually abandoned the island several weeks earlier and had left their fortifications behind. There was no need for an invasion. So those invasions were incredibly important. But the rest of Alaska, far away from the Aleutians, also saw a great deal of action. One of the most amazing feats of engineering to come out of the war would be the Alaska Highway. Prior to 1942, the only ways to access Alaska were by ship or by air. There was no land route through Canada, through the Yukon Territory and British Columbia. Incredibly rugged terrain there as well. There was no land route to access most of Alaska. So in 1942, after the Japanese invasion of Attu and Kiska, when it became clear that Alaska would be incredibly important in the war, the Army and then Congress authorized the building of a highway. Now, talks had been in place to build a highway through Canada to Alaska for decades, but the war spurred that into action. Construction would start on the Alaska Highway on March 8th, 1942, and it would be completed on October 28th, 1942. Over 1,000 miles of roadway completed in just about 7 months through some of the most rugged terrain on the planet. And so that highway would be used to ferry men, vehicles, and supplies to Alaska. Another point of activity in Alaska during World War II had to do with the Lend-lease program, where the United States was providing material aid to those fighting the Germans. And while we initially started off giving aid to Great Britain, we would soon add the Soviet Union to that list once they had turned from being their non-aggression pact with Nazi Germany to being our allies. And the question was how to get things to the Soviet Union. Most of the routes to get to the Soviet Union were incredibly dangerous and difficult, but the most direct route to get airplanes to the Soviet Union was actually through Alaska. So the Lend-lease program saw thousands of airplanes being ferried through Alaska, stopping at bases along the Alaska Highway as it was under construction, until they were ferried about 90 miles northwest of where I'm standing to Fairbanks, what was known as Ladd Field in Fairbanks, where Soviet pilots would pick them up and then fly them the rest of the way to Siberia. As well, about almost straight behind me, if you could see it, is Fort Greely, which after the war would become the home of the Army's Arctic training, of the Army's cold weather testing and training centers. The incredibly difficult fighting on Attu, as well as in the Italian Alps during the World War II, showed that the US Army needed better training for dealing with cold weather. And so a special school was established here in the interior of Alaska to provide training as well as testing for Army materials to see how it would function in cold weather. So despite Alaska's incredible remoteness, it still played a vital role and was a site of incredible activity during World War II.